Okay, this is going to be quite an annoying recording, simply because it's going to be, by necessity, sort of unelegant. So I'm annoyed with myself that I haven't found a perfect synthesis of metagram and metatype, and I'm going to sort of take a step back from that and broadly, I had metagram in my mind quite finely developed, and I knew that I had to develop metatype up to the same degree of specificity before I could hopefully find some kind of integration between the two. I feel like metatype is at that level. Metatype now is, I think, very robust and specific. Um, Metagram itself might be fundamentally, there is a bridge between them, which I'm going to explore in this recording. Um, but it's not satisfying because it doesn't uh, vindicate um, the entire system, but it could indirectly help confirm the system in just that the bridge that I'm going to speak about is going to be, it's going to provide a lot of explanatory power in terms of um, analyzing behavior with regard to metatype. So let me just frame some of these things nicely. So metatype essentially is all about self-actualization. Is probably the best way to speak about it. Um, so metatype will tell you what cognitive functions are doing or playing what kind of role within the four sides of the mind, within between the superego, the subconscious, the unconscious, and the ego, and that will also have a ontological, um, let's say, if you knew someone's metatype, and then they had the metatype model according to, to my system, they would be able to use it quite usefully as a tool for self-actualization. They'd be able to retrace a kind of ontological development of each side of the mind and how the sides of the mind are integrated with one another. All that stuff is very complicated as well because there's so much interwoven interrelation between the sides of the mind. And a good analog of this is the Keegan stages, which I would say that metatype, as I've developed it, is a much stronger. Uh, yeah, so within the box of sort of the Keegan stages, I think that metatype is far superior, um, and far more specific, um, and descriptive, for describing someone's personal psychology. Now, I have specifically taken issue with the Keegan stages because I believe that what he describes as Keegan stage 5 or um, is actually a kind of uh, obstacle that's still between Keegan stage 3 and Keegan stage 2, because I believe that essentially you have to reduce everything into Keegan stage. Keegan stage 2 is not a stage that you ever, you have to function with these stages in tandem. You don't graduate from one and move on to the next. And there's a higher rate of functioning of Keegan stage 2 with the higher stages. Um, so I have a more sort of integrated kind of modeling of these things, but that is much more specific with the how the sides of the mind interrelate and what each of them are doing. But basically, just Keegan stage 2, I translated into my system is the subconscious. Keegan stage 3 is the unconscious, and Keegan stage 4 is the ego. And Keegan stage 5 would be the integration of the ego with the superego, which is Keegan stage 1. The superego is Keegan stage 1. So his Keegan stage 5 I regard as essentially the proper integration between the ego and the superego, which I'm not going to talk about now because I've got lots of recordings about that. So moving on. So someone mentioned this to me, and I think this is also a good way of distinguishing these two different between metatype and metagram. Is that metatype is very internal. It's very personal in some sense. It's sort of it deals with spiritual issues like transpersonal and uh, how you relate to the world as a whole through how you're relating to these cognitive functions and how they sit within the structures of the various sides of the mind. So there's this personal and transpersonal emphasis in metatype, but there's no real interpersonal. The metatype does not describe the interpersonal dimension. The interpersonal dimension is all uh, bound within metagram. And I'll say as well that I think that somebody else brought this issue up to me. They were asking about Enneagram. A lot of people are interested in the Enneagram. And it's interesting how Enneagram seems to be a kind of consort to MBTI in the typology community. People will ask, what's your MBTI and what's your Enneagram? Because they seem to be roughly separable, although there are some stereotypes, or there are lots of stereotypes of, particular types that have a particular Enneagram, but that there's a correlation, but there's not always a fixed correlation. There are legitimately at least many variants of a particular MBTI type that will have many Enneagram types. Now, I think that this is correspondent with my metagram circuitry and metatype circuitry. Metatype is very much like MBTI in what it's describing. The definition of MBTI in the theoretical sense is that MBTI is how you process information. It's the cognitive. It's how you use cognitive functions to process information. That's what the 8 cognitive functions, or at least the 4 cognitive functions, which is where it kind of started, is describing. It's describing your preference and your strength of being able to digest information with cognitive functions. That's what MBTI model essentially is. Socionics is different. Socionics is not informational, it's motivational. So socionics is a bit of a hybrid in some sense, potentially, but it almost leans it yeah, I almost don't want to comment on it because it's such a hybrid. Anyway, but let me just say that socionics attempts to describe, let's say, impetus and motivational use of cognition. So it's an interesting thing I imagine that socionics typing and Enneagram typing maybe, I mean, I'm speculating, might have a stronger correlation of almost um, more fixed sort of typecast sort of pantheons of correlation. Anyway, that's not important. Okay, so Enneagram, oh, so metagram. So metagram I've already tried to describe as the interpersonal dimension. Now, why is it the interpersonal dimension? I'll have to talk about what the composite components of metagram are. So I've described metagram before as karma. And so if you have a metatype, which I believe that you can't ever not have a metatype. So if you have a metatype, this is speculative, so I haven't been able to finish any of this stuff. It's all sort of up in the air, but I speculate that you can't get rid of your metatype, but you can essentially dissolve your metagram circuitry, which I still think is useful to do, or at least to disambiguate yourself. No, actually, the opposite of that. To sort of ambiguate your metagram circuitry, to enlarge it. Uh, but you have to enlarge. It's not possible to just mechanically do this. You have to understand what it is. So I think that the mastery of metagram is something like a kind of metaphysics or spiritual philosophy or morality, uh, largely speaking. I do think that, but it also heavily pertains to a kind of experiential wisdom. So a lot of this stuff I think can't really be. It's not cerebral, as it were. It can't just be read. It has to sort of be understood. Um, on a kind of on an authentic and a deep level, in a way that sort of it sunk into your subconscious, that sunken into your Keegan stage 2. Um, okay, so how to describe this? So basically, you have your metatype, which you even have at a very young age, and I do believe that very young children don't have a metagram type. They have a metatype, but they don't have a metagram yet. And essentially what happens is once more sides of your mind start getting thrown into the mix, start developing and growing and maturing, you get certain, how would I describe it? You get certain developmental benchmarks or progress, and what happens is, once I think you reach the anchored development of the ego only gets anchored once the unconscious is working in conjunction with it. So once your unconscious starts, once you start developing your unconscious, your ego very quickly works out that there's this kind of dimension of bad faith that you can get into with yourself. And this is like a very toxic form of involution. It's like incepting yourself, like the movie Inception, where you go a dream within a dream within a dream. It gets very problematic. And that kind of opens a Pandora's box. And you have to develop some kind of meta-morality to somewhat deal with that. And I think sort of the lowest common denominator, sort of evolutionary fix for this, is that you entrench yourself you identify each side of the mind takes upon itself a kind of characteristic emotional tone. It creates an idolatry of the self. And what I mean by that is that, and I take this from a kind of spiritual teaching, that man is made in the image of God. And therefore, if you have an image, when I say, I should also correct this, in some of my older recordings, when I talk about this, I don't specify, and it's perhaps misleading to not specify this. When I say that it's problematic to make an image of yourself, what is yourself is the basic question. It's not your body, it's not your flesh, it's the intellect, it's the spiritual volitional. It's in some sense, your mind is probably the closest thing to it, although the mind is somewhat the vehicle. This is partly the problem of what I'm trying to get into describing here, is that when you identify yourself with the mind, or you identify yourself with an intellectual attitude, with an intellectual disposition, when that becomes your identity, then the mind has superseded the intellect. So the understanding becomes constricted, or within some pattern, a kind of contrivance, and I'm going to explain what these sort of patterns are. So I think each side of the mind essentially establishes a kind of bastion around a kind of self-image or identity. Now, this bastion is an attitude. It's a style of cognition, or it's two cognitive functions inflected upon each other. And so you've got a kind of a go-to style guide that tells you what each side of the mind is doing. And although it doesn't tell you the content of each side of the mind, it tells you the style that each side of the mind is operating in the valence thereof. So you know the attitude of each side of the mind. Therefore, each other side of the mind can understand the magisterium that each side of the mind contains, and can work around that magisterium to some degree. Now, this is not entirely true as well, because there are other problems in the world other than avoiding not clashing styles. So metagram circuitry is only half a solution to it. It's a bad solution. But when I say it's bad in more than one way. It's bad in the sense that, first of all, you've put yourself in a captivation. You've placed yourself captive and servicing this robotic style output. But also it's bad because that's no way to have, even the style itself is not enough. Knowing what the style of each other side of the mind is doing does not allow each side of the mind not to step on each other's toes, because there's a kind of metaphysical morality. There's a higher morality at play. And so if one side of the mind is using a particular attitude, a cognitive inflection in a certain way, it's going to have a kind of systemic, in terms of emotional tones, metagram emotional tones, it's going to have an indirect reverberation or induction on the other ones through a kind of metamorality. I'm going to talk about those sort of metamorality themes and patterns. Okay, so so let me talk about emotional tones. So man, this is not helpful. I should actually have more of my notes in front of me, or I'm going to make stupid clerical mistakes that could easily be avoided. Oh, come on. Where? Oh my word, where did I put that? Where are those books? Oh, here they are. Okay. Okay, so no, wait. I think that the aspect that I wanted to bring up will be actually impossible for me to communicate in this recording. It's way too sort of technical and strange, and it's another element of sort of one of the technical patterns in it. But okay, anyway, let me just move on. So I will touch on it. I will be able to outline that. But okay, so there are 24 emotional tones, or 24 specific cognitive inflections, and these 24 emotional tones can be subdivided into what I would call 4 field circuits. Now, there are only 3 ingredients in each field circuit. There are only 3 cognitive functions in each field circuit. So there are only 12 ingredients, but how those ingredients combine with each other, there are only ever two there are only ever 2 cognitive functions that relate to each other to make a cognitive function. And it's always 2 out of 3. So the important thing here is that there are 6 emotional tones in each field circuit, and each field circuit in some sense can be philosophically even simplified into just 3 cognitive functions. So knowing that there are 3 cognitive functions and knowing that there are 6 ways of combining them will give you a full description of that field circuit. Now, there are other ways of categorizing cognitive functions, which, if I start getting into that, it gets very, very complicated because, and these patterns of subdivision are technically interesting, and they also have to do with metagram, which I haven't fully gotten to terms with myself in terms of understanding my own notes, because I've tried to reverse engineer them, and it's very complicated, which is troubling to me. But essentially the emotional tone that is contained within the unconscious and the superego, or should I say the emotional tone that is generated between the unconscious and the superego. If you take each cognitive function, you can also assign them one of four alchemical elements. And each field circuit has a unique mix of alchemical elements if you relate, if you make the subdivision. And the only reason why the alchemical elements is useful is because there are consistent patterns of metagram circuitry which only become visible if you break down cognitive functions by alchemical elements. So that subcategory, which doesn't fit neatly into the field circuits, it's a separate subdivision, is a useful pattern. Now, what's also more complicated, and I haven't been able to reverse engineer this, is that some people don't just have one emotional tone in their ego or in their subconscious. Some people will actually have two emotional tones or an ulterior emotional tone. So some people will actually have two emotional tones and other people will have one or the other. It'll be a so some people have an and some people have an or between two emotional tones in their stimulus. So that already describes sort of three different types of circuitry. Some people have a I would say that the and ones are more rigid because they have like two filters running on that side of the mind. Whereas if you have an or filter, if you could use one emotional tone or alternatively a different emotional tone, then you have much more flexibility. And then the ego just has or, it doesn't have and. So the ego's emotional tones are the ones that have more than one. They're not and, they're both. They're not and, they are always alternative. So that's also slightly so the stimulus, or the, I call it the stimulus, but the emotional tone that pertains to the subconscious can have two emotional tones or an alternative, but the ego will only, if it does have more than one, it'll always be an alternative. It won't be two simultaneously. Okay. Anyway, now another thing. Is that the field circuits themselves, I'm just trying to think all the things that I should say. So because the field circuits themselves are comprised of their own special set of alchemical sub-elements, each side of the mind then, each field circuit becomes unique in two different ways. It is unique. The one uniqueness is that the mix of the alchemical elements is distinct to that field circuit. But there's another subdivision of cognitive functions that you can do that I just take the jargon from Hinduism, that some cognitive functions, and this also comes from the alchemical subdivision. The alchemical subdivision comes from the fact that there are 3 sets of 4 cognitive functions. So there are 4 alchemical elements, and then there are 3 subtypes of sattva, rajas, and tamas. So that makes 12. And so I can describe the field circuits in both ways. I can describe them as, sort of that, let's say the first field circuit has got the water element of sattva. It's got the wait. I usually, it's going to get confusing. Let me start with the different field circuit, which I'll call the first circuit. Okay, so the first field circuit has got the fire element of sattva, the water element of tamas, and the earth element of rajas. And the second field circuit has got the water element of sattva, the fire element of rajas, and the air element of tamas. And the third field circuit has got the air element of rajas, the fire element of tamas, and the earth element of sattva. And the fourth field circuit has got the water element of rajas, the air element of sattva, and the earth element of tamas. Now, the reason why I gave sattva, tamas, or rajas in different orders for each field circuit is because I was also ordering them according to the number in which they appear in the 17 model. I was ordering them from the lower dimension to the higher dimension, which means that the last one that I referred to could be seen as the most directive, could be seen as the most senior, although that's a bit perhaps too simplistic, because the actual internal rigor or the internal interrelation between these 3 functions is going to create its own kind of unique synthesis and dynamics, because they don't correspond all 3 directly together. They correspond in compounds of 2 of the 3. And then they all play a kind of rock, paper, scissors between the 2 and the 3, where one compound, it literally is rock, paper, scissors. So there are 6 emotional tones in each field circuit. 3 of them are literally rock, paper, scissors. The other 3, I call them just kind of expressive functions or amplifiers or kickers, because all they do is they kind of show an entrenched position. I often regard these as holding charge, that they hold a kind of entrenched position that can be translated into their consort of the rock, paper, scissors. And then when it's in the rock, paper, scissors, it's vulnerable to being mitigated or being transferred or being counteracted or sort of. So the kind of the rock, paper, scissors ones, I often call those kind of counter offers. and these are, I think this is a description of how karma functions. um, Mental karma. Karma literally just means consequence. So it means that when you're expressing an emotional tone, you are um, in the field of producing either catalytically or chemically uh, some kind of motion, some kind of. Now, I would argue that, and this is too abstract to be useful, but how you solve karma, how you transcend karma, is that when you understand. And by the way, I've always regarded that these emotional tones would be useful as a therapeutic tool. I just never developed them because I was busy working on metatype. But I always considered that the metagram emotional tones could itself be an independent psychological sort of treatment program, or the basis of one, because you can kind of use it like a kind of feng shui, in that people are going to have certain reticence, they're going to have certain resentment, they're going to have certain unfinished business, or a kind of foreboding, or a kind of reactive tendency towards the rock, paper, scissors emotional tones that are connected to their emotional tone that they use within the ambit of the same field circuit. People are going, and so you can kind of use this as a kind of exposure therapy, where you can kind of understand the connection between all the emotional tones, and how each of the emotional tones is counteracted by one of the other emotional tones. And then when you kind of see that at a broader picture, you can kind of see the drama that you are creating for yourself, that you are perpetuating. And so the way to get away from that drama is that you have to take a position in which you're communicating that position through the vehicle of an emotional tone, because you'll never get away from expressing things through an emotional tone. You can't not use cognitive inflections. That's, in some sense, they come from communication, or they're most. Anyway, I don't want to get into that metaphysical quandary just yet, but how you do it is you take a position in which you respect each emotional tone having its own place, and you express a position, or you accept a position on all of the emotional tones in that field circuit simultaneously, that you are expressing a model of the entire structure of that field circuit. Now, that is so broad and abstract. It might also be wrong. It's slight speculation, but I would say that essentially, that then in context, you are resonating with, leaning towards a particular emotional tone that you are seemingly communicating. But the point of that communication is that it's meant to kind of be transparent, because you're meant to kind of intimate to people what the undergirding, or model of all the emotional tones that you have commitment to. Is that how I should say it? So in some sense, you're not ganging up on an emotional tone within the circuitry and scapegoating it. Instead, you are showing a kind of holistic treatment of all the emotional tones, but in context you will seemingly be a partisan for a particular emotional tone because you're basically trying to say, well, that's what's lacking here, that's what we should add, that's what we should raise our respect for in this context, or sharing this purpose, or communicating a purpose to be collaborated with. Not that everyone is capable of being coordinated with. Um, okay, so what's the point here? Is that okay? Now, what I was saying earlier was very technical about, sort of the this of sattva and the that of tamas. Okay, so the first field circuit, I'm going to go over it again, but now I'm going to describe it in terms of the 17 model, in which it'll be a lot more personable. So the first field circuit, which I believe corresponds with the beast, that one of the four beasts that surrounds the throne of God described in Revelations. These beasts are described as having eyes that look inwards, and 6 wings. They are all described as having 6 wings. Okay, so the first field circuit comprises of dimension 1, dimension 10, and dimension 15. Dimension 1 I also sometimes refer to as the flesh. Dimension 10 I refer to as trust, and dimension 15 is probably the easiest way is to say that it pertains to the gift of the evangelist, but let me use the other word as exuberance. Let me just use, so dimension 1, I'll use my one, okay, I won't use my spiritual religious language. I'll use my the other jargon that I created for the 12 cognitive functions. Dimension 1 is instinct, dimension 10 is trust, dimension 15 is exuberance. Okay, now that is called the lion, because dimension 1 is what will be, is any mental grammar, any cognition that man, I can't remember the phrasing that I used to use for this. My definition of a cognitive function. Any thought form that satisfies the formula what will be is instinct, dimension 1. And any thought form that satisfies the formula what shall be is dimension 10, trust. And any thought form that satisfies the formula or the cognitive grammar what is, what something is, what things are, is dimension 15, exuberance. So that's why I call it the evangelist, because evangelist tells you what something really is, which is a very esoteric spiritual sort of thing. I mean, science doesn't know anything about what anything is. They only know how it operates in the world. They don't know what things are. They know their definitions are literally hollow. They gave up intellectually honest semantics a long time ago. They used to have a kind of humility, a philosophical realism and pragmatism, when they said, no, we don't know what the quantity is. We'll call it a magnitude, because that's just what our measurement device tells us. It has a reading of a magnitude, but we don't know what the quantity is. We wouldn't be so hubristic. We wouldn't be so conceited and arrogant as to say this is the quantity, as if we knew what was really there. anyway, and that is how they're sort of their hollow sort of Tower of Babel operates. But okay, the second field circuit, dimension 2, I call placidity, which is a bit of a made-up word because it's the combination of placid and placid meaning calm, and man, I've forgotten the second word that makes up placidity. It's something that means ductile. What's the other word that means something like ductile? Idity. What's the word that is idity, that bends and that is fluid? Wow, my memory is failing me. Placidity. Anyway, perhaps someone can guess the word. Placid and sort of okay, so placidity, dimension 5 is prudence, and dimension 8 is appraisal. And the spiritual terms of these is dimension 2 is the spirit, dimension 5 doesn't really have a special spiritual title, and dimension 8 I refer to as the earth. But anyway, so appraisal, prudence, and placidity, saying it backwards, and that relates, I think, to the beast of the calf. And I think that this calf beast is very important, because the spirit, dimension 2, is where God lives in dimension 2. The witness of God is in dimension 2. The spirit is the witness, is the only thing that can witness God. And so dimension 2, this whole field circuit that involves dimension 2 is very, very important. And you have to remember that some people, they don't have any emotional tone in the second field circuit. And so I think that some people don't appreciate the philosophy or the metaphysics of religion to a large degree, simply because they don't have a dog in the fight, as it were. Some people can naturally sort of feel almost the wind of God, as it were. They can feel a kind of a temperature in the atmosphere. There's a kind of gravity. And I think that all of this relates to the calf, or the second field circuit, because the dimension 2 is how things shall be. Dimension 5, or no, actually that doesn't sound right. I should rather say how things should be. How things should be. You see, there's nothing wrong with saying how things shall be, but it doesn't quite get the point across, because this is such a broad and fluid dimension. The second dimension is really so important. Everything is really the foundation of everything is in dimension 2. Dimension 1 is sort of chaff to be thrown away. It is just the sort of it's the envelope of dimension 2. It's the encapsulation of dimension 2. It's just so that dimension 2 can segregate itself from what it isn't. Dimension 2 is really the real foundation of the whole sort of cognitive stack. which everyone will have dimension 2 somewhere in their metatype, but they might not have it represented in their metagram attitude. But anyway, the reason why how things shall be doesn't quite sound right is because, well, where does the shall come from? And that is a broad, moral, metaphysical kind of question. Unless you already agree with me or you know some of my philosophy of self-determinism and an internal locus of control. Because then if you say how things shall be, well, obviously you have to decide, you have to discern how things shall be. And so you have to be committed, you have to be chosen of how things shall be. But that requires a kind of a footnote of sort of spiritual philosophy to get how things shall be. But in the more generic sense, you could say how things should be. And this is also very interesting because I would say that this is a kind of metaphysical bind that has people locked in Keegan stage 3, or has very toxic behavior that I've described as sort of cerebral histrionic and stuff like that. So I do think that there's a synthesis of the second field circuit, or let's say a holistic understanding of the second field circuit. And if you understand that second field circuit, I think you have it kind of it all. Now, okay, so yeah, me making this recording is a bit premature because it's just going to sound like boasting and talking about things that are not being sort of proved before your eyes. But I do think that I've potentially made a complete sort of breakthrough, and I'm very excited to kind of describe it. But I always have to pepper everything with the sort of the caveat that, sort of this is still research and slightly up in the air, and it will probably undergo some refinement, if not revision. But it looks to, unless I've made a kind of clerical error that's going to be the basis of some revision, it looks like that I now have a full picture of psychology. Yeah, which is an astounding claim to make. It's a huge claim to make. But so I was doing my darndest to reverse engineer my metagram circuitry, and I would say that I generally succeeded in that. There weren't errors in it, but there were certain inexactitudes which I knew about when I was perpetrating them, if I can put it like that, because I knew that I didn't have enough of a kind of theoretical overview to make finer distinctions than that. And so there are ambiguities, and these ambiguities I believe, unless I've made a clerical error, I have finally worked them out. And I can even go into detail as to why those ambiguities arise. So essentially, what it all boils down to is is almost a. I mean, I can convert this into a slightly religious question, but in the Hindu religion, they talk a lot about the three gunas, Raja, Sattva, and Tamas, and although the qualities of these things are given, the anatomy, the internal structure of these things, in terms of how they compose differently to one another, as far as I know, is not expounded on or elaborated anywhere in the Hindu in any of the Vedic texts, and certainly not the Gita. I believe I have the answer to that question, basically. Uh, and I can. I'm jumping all over the place. Okay, so. And it's interesting because I actually, I think I fully unlocked this after somewhat mulling over uh, a scripture from within 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 Revelations that talks about the four creatures or the four beasts, even that worship the throne of God, that have inward and outward looking eyes, and the one has uh, the head of a lion, the other one has sorry, you see, I'm just straining on the order, because the order that they are given, if you take the lowest dimension from the 12 extraction of the 17 model, if you take the 12 out and you take the lowest dimension, it corresponds to the order given in Revelations, at least in terms of the correspondences that I've made. But when you actually map them out in betwixt the emotional tones, which I also take to be the 24 elders. So the throne of God is mentioned as being surrounded by four beasts, and then surrounded by 24 thrones of the 24 elders. Now, I've got a different model. I've got a model seemingly of 8 things, but those 8 things are really 12 nodes. And those 12 nodes, or because some of them are compounded, 4 of them are compounded, they look like 8 sort of objects, and then they each have, or each of the 12 nodes has got arrows creating circuits. And so there are 12 arrowed circuits. Hopefully there'll be a diagram showing this. And essentially, a circuit is made up of 3 of those nodes. And so there are 4 circuits. And those 4 circuits can essentially be seen as the 4 beasts. But the order in that model, if I make that model, it goes lion, eagle, and then I guess you could switch it bottom left or bottom right, depending on which direction you're going to have the arrows, because the arrows, like if you depict it as, if the lion circuit is going to be clockwise, then the eagle is going to be anti-clockwise, and then the calf is going to be, sorry, I don't have a diagram in front of me right now. So if you say that if the line is clockwise, the eagle is would be anti-clockwise, and the calf, the arrows will go the same as the eagle then, and the man will go, the arrows will go the same way as the lion. And I put the man on the bottom right and the calf on the bottom left. Anyway, but you could invert the calf and the man if you just change the direction of the arrows. Anyway, I don't know if the directionality of the arrows, it does have a subtle. It's not going to. I don't know if that means that there's any special synergy between the man and the lion and the eagle and the calf. I don't think that there's any special synergy. The synergy that is special is in because each arrow, each connection with an arrow on it is going to be connecting 2 nodes, and the arrow, in some sense, man, this is so complicated. This arrow doesn't actually symbolize one emotional tone or cognitive inflection. It symbolizes potentially two cognitive inflections. But I use the arrows because it creates a kind of uniform pattern. And essentially, you could imagine an arrow going in the other direction because it is going both ways. But the one that goes the other way is fundamentally a different kind of emotional tone to the one that goes the one way. The one that goes because essentially there is an asymmetry between the two nodes that are connected. That's the bottom line. There's a fundamental asymmetry between those two types of emotional tones. And so by just putting all the arrows in the same conventional sense throughout the whole diagram, you can again the okay, well, I have to talk about the difference between the basic difference between these two types of emotional tones or cognitive inflections. So and this is going to be a slight revision on things that I used to say a long time ago while I was talking about metatype mainly, and I was focused on metatype, and I would talk about metagram in passing, and I think I've actually been saying it incorrectly. I've been saying it a bit backwards when I said that, that you get amplifying tones and you get negatory tones or negating tones. You get tones that where and so I would describe the amplifying tone as holding charge, and I would describe the negating tone as kind of conserving and beating up something else, as kind of being antagonistic or almost parasitic. So, for example, an, a positive charge or an amplifying charge was experiencing one cognitive function distinguished by yet another stronger cognitive function added to it. So, I think I call them additive. So you get additive emotional tones and then negatory or negating emotional tones, where you're experiencing the one emotional tone with an absent sense of another emotional tone, so that you're actually using an emotional tone to displace another emotional tone. Now, the reason why I said that I had it slightly backwards, and maybe I wasn't also completely wrong, but when you see it when you see the whole diagram as a connected flow chart, as a kind of, which I'm now calling the anatomy of karmic morality, which is something like the medium of the world that we all live through in some sense, or I don't mean that in the same way that we all have to live through language and communication, but well, even that word is ambiguous, communication, because that can be quite spiritual, but that we have to use language in order to facilitate communication. So we have to learn, I think, essentially to see through this model of karmic morality, as it were. I mean, that's a bit of a slight misnomer as well. There's perhaps a bit of an oxymoron. But essentially, this is the anatomy of karma. And so this exists within an individual, and it will exist in some sense as an aura that will perhaps meld with other people's contribution to this as a kind of subtle antagonism or induction for other people to meld with. And how I see this working is that each side of the mind is going to have its own ideation or I do see each side of the mind as almost being its own person, pretty much. The subconscious is not the same person as the ego. This is why people have this kind of cognitive dissonance, have this kind of sometimes quite unconscious, you could call it, um, self-sabotage, but also, other expressions of spite, etc., etc. Anyway, but perhaps why you literally confabulate in your own cogniting, so that you engineer your own particular dissatisfaction, or people will sometimes be even flabbergasted from their ego, thinking back how they knew that they had to remember something, that they did remember it, and then immediately 2 moments later, um, they simply negated it. And I would argue that there's probably sort of a fight between the subconscious and the ego, because the ego wants to facilitate some kind of fatalistic redress. Sorry, I should have stated that slightly more elegantly, but a kind of, to force a kind of because the subconscious is saddled with the beliefs that it's saddled with, and if it's not given a convention in order to uh, reconvene its own structure, and you're so ego involuted that you're not functioning on the level of your subconscious. You do give up some capability. If you integrate the ego and the subconscious, you gain a lot more authenticity, but you lose some proficiency, some ego proficiency, and other people, especially under the cult of ego exactitude, and formalistic, sort of box ticking. What you lose in that, you gain in ability. But a lot of people, they have to contend with so many tripwires and booby traps, and sort of circuitous and sort of surreptitious forms of decompartmentalization, that their ego is so defensive, that their subconscious gets into such a wild state of anarchic discontent, and anyway, and what that means in terms of the karmic thing is that you've got an emotional tone that your subconscious is grounded in, that has its footing constituted from. And that's somewhere on this anatomy diagram. And then you have your ego emotional tone, which is somewhere else on this diagram. And the distance between those two things are going to be a kind of subtle internal connectivity. There's going to be a kind of knock on sympathy that holds these things into some kind of internal alignment. And if one is capable of doing this separately from one's environment, all the better, because then one will have, let's say, a kind of protective coating, a kind of encapsulation, in which one does not need other people to facilitate the the playing delivery service between these two, perhaps dislocated by quite far distance, or they're not going to have their messages, between one another. They're not going to be intercepted by environmental interference. but so they're kinds of pathologies which probably relate specifically to not having a mastery or some kind of awareness or some, and it's very hard, I would say, for most people to learn this, but I mean that's mainly a cultural and a pedagogical deficit that we have, and also in parenting and perhaps in psychology as well, poverty of philosophy and knowledge in general. But it might be one of the requisites to, and this has an asterisk that I'm going to talk about later about other special characteristics that make this harder for some people than others. Um, is that the only way to start to see this anatomy of moral karma or karmic morality is if you're capable of not identifying with your own emotional tones, which might sound impossible, but I think that is where the via negativa that is specifically elicited in the Christian scripture, the teaching of Jesus, um, that one must hate your mother and your father and your brother and your sister and even your own life to be worthy to be a disciple. That you will not be able to untie yourself from this kind of transfixion and ideation and idolatry, because all these emotional tones are idolatries, that even as you begin to be able to penetrate and to see through and to make translucent by hating everything the same, because if you try to hate, not, that's a bad way of phrasing it, if you try to hate everything, you can't hate things too much. Because if you try to hate something too much, then you won't be able to hate something else as much. So you actually you get to the point where you actually have to hate something a little bit less so that you can hate something else just as much. And then you see, once you have this, because it's the awareness of the darkness, it's the awareness of what is evil, that is essentially um, the trackable quantity that can start to settle the mysteries, that can start to make the mysteries quantifiable into um, resolution and clarity, and actually contrasting them and discerning the spirits. And you can't do that if you're in the reveling of your own, uh, you know, even your own valence, as it were. You have to look past that as well and contrast that with what other valence might I have. Let me hate my own personality and see if there's not another personality uh, uh, that somehow can attract and repel the quantity of hate that I have for my own personality, because it's in some sense that's the glitch in the matrix that leads to sort of the way out, as it were. But anyway, the way out here, so this perhaps argued slightly badly, but anyway, is that you start being able to see this, that you can plot yourself on a model like this. I think that's what you're almost growing in awareness of. That's the kind of, I mean, this is potentially a model of a kind of a way of understanding something like objective morality, but it's not. It can't be. It has to be personally known and believed. It can't. It has to be personally experienced and evaluated. It can't be because it's not objective in the sense that because in some sense this is the model of the illusion of the world. This is not, in as much as you can say that there is a truth of the world, it's a way of describing the convoluted lie that the world sort of paints you with, or that you have incepted yourself into, or accepted the marking thereof, the marking of the beast. Okay, so I think that can be quite a resolution to quite many mysteries. But anyway, but more importantly, what we are sadly experiencing in a lot of ways is feedback and resonance, in terms of not even, I mean, obviously, if you get aggressed upon in terms of your actual emotional tones that you use for processing and digesting information, these are the cognitive inflections which are the characteristic province of your base, of your of the I, it's hard to describe it, but essentially held in your inferior functions are images, essentially, of how that side of the mind relates to other sides of the mind. So, in terms of how that side of the mind has a characteristic edifice, has a characteristic platform that makes it, that creates a province, a bubble, a sphere of operation for its side of the mind. So, inferior functions are not just the inferior functions of some other side of the mind, they are the platform for the next side of the mind. And that platform needs an image. It needs a graven image of your future self and of your intellect. And that's what these emotional tones are. They are forms of idolatry, because they displace, in some sense, the true glory and understanding and worship uh, of God, of true authority, in some sense. Um, of and there is a glory which is given to uh, uh, the Son of God and the servants, uh, uh, those who do the will of the Father. There's a glory to those who do the will of the Father, and that glory that is given to such service is the mark of justice, essentially, is righteousness. That is the mark of the Lamb. But anyway, so there is an innate drama in this model or anatomy of karmic morality, and the drama is not just directly in people conflicting with each other's specific emotional tones. It's conflicting in the channels of convenience and conveyance, and, let's say, the subtle delivery conduits that interlock and interrelate between these things, because people uh, anyway, this is going to be slightly different for each type. Each type might place a different kind of cognitive dissonance, might create a different kind of scapegoat within the drama. They might specifically have developed a kind of scapegoating antagonism in order to offload and to divert pressure onto vilification, essentially. Okay, so I'm just saying so many general things. Let me get on to something useful. Okay. Now, so uh, the reason why also the arrows do make sense to have them go in one direction. Hmm. Is because essentially in each pair of emotional tones, hmm, so I'm just trying to think how to word this. Anyway, it basically it supports. I can't find a technical way of describing it 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 perfectly, but with these arrows, okay, well, if I'm correct in having judged and evaluated somewhat separately that there are 24 emotional tones that each have a very particular form of comprised component parts. If I'm correct in what those constituent parts are, in, for example, one circuit of three of connected by three arrowed lines, each arrowed line symbolizes two emotional tones, and both emotional tones are made up of the same two cognitive functions, which are being linked by those two arrows. But obviously, each node has two connections, one before it and one after it. So if you track one emotional tone, it's always in two out of the three. Because these things, in some sense, are all like triangles. So one corner is always connected to two sides of the three sides of a triangle. Okay, so what can I say about this? So I don't have the eloquence to state this so technically and beautifully. So I'll just say it'll have to be. I'll have to sort of, if I write the book, which I should write, I'll have to neaten this up. But man, how do I say this as well? I guess I'll just have to say it out loud. Before doing any of this, I had the 12 model, the 12 cognitive functions, and I divided them into uh, the divided line, or the four base alchemical elements: earth, water, wind, fire. That was a terrible order. That's the order that they give in the fifth element. But let me put them in order of the divided line from the smallest segment to the largest segment. It's earth, fire, water, air. And if you do that, if you let's say if you've appropriately assigned each cognitive function one of those four elements, you get three of each, and that also corresponds to sattva, rajas, and tamas. But essentially, all emotional tones, you could say then, you see, I'm getting, what I'm having trouble describing in this recording is how to, there's no eloquent way that I can think of to describe that, that there is a leading element, and then there is the second cognitive function is almost like a kind of, is a consort. So there's a main cognitive function and there's a consort cognitive function. And the main cognitive function, therefore, is what I would associate with a particular guna. And each cognitive function, each of the four cognitive functions in each guna, four in terms of the alchemical elements, will only have one consort. It won't have more than one. Each will only have one consort. And the consort that it makes is always the same in terms of how it. So sattva consorts are always tamas, and rajas consorts are always sattva, and tamas consorts are always rajas. And that is perfectly depicted with these arrows, essentially. That the arrow points towards the consort, and then, man, this is going to be confusing. I'm sorry to say that they're not actually arrows. They're actually meant to be greater than signs. And so it's not ahead of an arrow, but it is saying that the connected node is lesser than the earlier node. Okay, so the node at the point of the arrow leading from the arrow is smaller than the node at the start of the arrow line. Okay, so that's what that means. And so these arrows. Okay, so now this, you know, when I was making metagram circuitry, which that is something, or the aspect that I'm going to talk about, this is slightly embarrassing, that I don't know if it can ever really be engineered, because the only way that I was even able to observe metagram circuitry was almost becoming completely, or was by having a major manic episode so that I could condense all of my experience of tracking cognitive functions and observing people's behavior and try to find patterns. And then after doing that, in order to make a model of emotional tones, which I did make a model of emotional tones, which then I corresponded to the 12 extraction from the 17 model. Once having those emotional tones, I was able to model particular circuitry in people. I had the vocabulary to witness and observe the particular internal, you know, which was, you know, I mean, that's almost like a kind of, look, this is a bit spooky, because this is literally saying, oh, I have the power of telepathy. I mean, that is what is required in order to do this kind of work. You need be able to do that. And it requires empathy, which requires a huge amount of imagination, you could say that, and a huge amount of kind of experience and intellectual, particular experience, as it were. Um, you need the application of imagination. You need, let's say, the tolerance and the endurance of 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 analyzing someone, the exposure, as it were. And then you populate it with what are the fixed nodes, what are the fixed um, what are the axial uh, uh, pivots that everything else is circulating around, the axial uh, uh, structure that everything else is circulating around. And it seemed that there was a consistent pattern between some of these things. One consistent pattern was that what I called the primary counteroffer was always inverse to the emergent response. And the emergent response I now take in my current overlay between metagram and metatype, that the emergent response corresponds to the ego, and the primary counteroffer corresponds uh, uh, this is not without qualification, but without when I say without qualification, I mean there's some asterisks attached to this. It applies to the superego and the unconscious side of the mind. The reason why there's an asterisk is because the superego has a kind of private sanctum. It's kind of like the bit of the computer that it can't be read, but it has the power to write some stuff in the system. So it produces an output, and it has a kind of shell um, that the rest of the computer identifies as itself, as that character. So it takes on the role of a particular character, but it's kind of beyond the curtain. Um, what's my point? But the unconscious side of the mind is I believe the primary counteroffer, and the stimulus is the subconscious. And although this is perhaps speculative, my current working model is that ontologically the emergent response actually develops first from the superego. So in some sense, the primary counteroffer happens in some sense in the primordial sense of the superego first, although I don't know if you can really call it the primary counteroffer at that point. Sort of weans the emergent response from nothing, and then the emergent response is arguably not even developed, or the ego is developing, and then it actually seeds the stimulus. And then after the stimulus has emerged, which is in some sense the new personality of the very young juvenile child, that then has to grow into the primary counteroffer. And when the stimulus and the primary counteroffer are both simultaneously present, then the emergent response, then the ego can actually properly develop, because otherwise it doesn't even have an anchor, it doesn't have a footing. So to talk about the ego as even having a character is almost impossible, because it doesn't have any, um, it's missing any weight behind it. It's missing an anchor. Um, so in a kind of in an epistemological sense, the it's hard to say if maybe the superego could be regarded as foremost, but the subconscious, you see, like the superego and the ego are actually very closely related, ontologically even. They are very much adjacent and adjunct with each other, and somewhat connected. And the subconscious is kind of out on its own. It's out in the cold, and it grew up independently. And it is the source of a kind of independent drive and impetus. And that's why there's often an antagonism between the subconscious and the superego. Also, there's a natural antagonism between the subconscious and the superego, because the subconscious fundamentally negates the superego. Subconscious um, is born out of the failure of the superego, but there's also a part of the superego that never enters ever into a kind of integration with what I would call the false ego complex, or the general sort of development of the stuff that's can only be managed by the ego. So you kind of have to get your ego reconciled with your subconscious and the superego, which will involve also the unconscious. And all these things are almost happening simultaneously, or they're all can be said as also happening each independently. And so, but you can also see what happens in terms of this anatomy of karma, which I almost think that this anatomy of karma or objective morality can even be seen with the unconscious side of the mind is preoccupied with. That the unconscious is going to say, I do think that you don't even have a solidified or a crystallized or a concretized false ego complex of emotional tones until your unconscious has properly developed up to that point. So when you're still a subconscious, I don't think even your stimulus emotional tone has even been set until you have an unconscious emotional tone correspondent with it, because that unconscious emotional tone is going to write itself into this constitution, into this unconscious document, as it were, or this unconscious because in some sense, when the unconscious identifies itself as having a particular character, and therefore mirrors within that self recognition its own ontological source of the subconscious, you never had solidity. You were always just a kind of fluidity. You were an oceanic, perhaps consciousness, or something like that. Um, so it's the state of the unconscious side of the mind that has precipitated the kind of the rigidity of banging your head against this this objective karmic morality that you have been incepted into because of identifying with these emotional tones and not being able to fluidly disengage from that idolatry. Okay, so what is my point? My point is oh, oh, yeah, when I was talking about the arrows a while ago, when I was saying right at the start, anti-clockwise and clockwise, I think I got that in reverse. So I hope you're looking at the diagram and then I guess just realize that I'm very bad at remembering which way is clockwise and which way is anti-clockwise. Um, did I say the line was clockwise? Anyway, okay, so isn't any other point other than idolatry? Okay, so certain sides of the mind are going to be associated with different segments of this diagram, and they're going to have a kind of systemic knock on sympathy, influence, or aura, kind of karmic aura, and perhaps a kind of polarization or a kind of ionic preference in terms of being in alignment with certain environmental features, etc., because of these components of internal processing. And yeah, so I do think that this model might be useful in massaging out and being used in a kind of perhaps an a more sophisticated version of uh, dialectical behavior therapy, DBT. This could be perhaps a more targeted kind of DBT. Might even be able to more precisely diagnose which of the circuits are being assuming that the problem is not the actual emotional tone itself, it's one of the adjacent emotional tones, it's one of the interlacing, interconnecting delivery vehicles of the emotional tones that is being burdened or projected on or hobbled or contorted. Or is in some sense being gainsayed or had a kind of hearsay um, extracted from it. That's a weird way of putting it. Essentially, it's been puppeted. That there's a kind of puppet projection on it. Which can also correspond with, sort of models that have been spoken about in borderline personality disorder and narcissism, where you have an introjective, I'm going to call it an introjective paradigm. People talk about introjects, but I mean, I'll talk about the place in which that they exist. They exist within an introjective paradigm. You can't make introjects unless you are interacting with an introjective paradigm. And I would say that this is essentially the landscape of this model of karmic morality is the introjective paradigm, which is something to do with the unconscious. And perhaps it's also that the unconscious has been hijacked by the subconscious, that or the subconscious has created a kind of push button belief imprint of the unconscious, so that the unconscious can even be bypassed. Because if the unconscious was, let's say, being authentically operated, then you wouldn't be involute, or you wouldn't have recourse to an introjective paradigm. So in some sense, I think that it's a substitute for entering into the unconscious side of the mind. Um, which can perhaps also be both a crutch, but also that these people have. This is why borderlines and narcissists can in some generalized form be said to have a kind of fragile ego that is very caustic and stringent and capable of defending itself, or in the borderlines case, it's capable of dissolving and reconstituting itself like a chameleon, or ducking things conveniently, but very analytically. You can, like, oh, well, it's very interesting that now you chose to devolve into an infantile, sort of, so the chess playing demon, as it were, playing these valences and these roles, is because the subconscious and perhaps also because the ego itself is tethered and subordinate to the superego, that the superego is still pulling the strings, but there's actually a kind of corresponding collusion between the superego using the ego as its toy, but that the subconscious is in on this game, that the subconscious is in it. So you've got the stimulus emotional tone, and you've got the primary counteroffer emotional tone, that have created a kind of hideous alliance in which they are using the ego as a foil, as the cat's paw. And even the primary counteroffer is capable of playing hide and seek about itself, because the superego does not have to care about the unconscious. And so it really, and the subconscious can just play naive, it can just play stupid. The subconscious can always just duck. And so you've got this kind of perpetual sorry, I'm mainly talking about borderline. I need to think about if this is the same for narcissism. But anyway, I think that fully describes borderline. But let me think about narcissism. Man, I can't even remember the last thing that I said about narcissism. I think it's a slight inversion. I think it is an ego, but it's a fragile ego because maybe because the subconscious is literally dependent on a kind of environmental, i.e., unconscious diminution, but also environmental, let me call it environmental identification. By that I mean also that connotates to a narcissistic supply. Um, and I mean, I'd have to think about even the things that I've said about narcissism before, because I've described the addiction of it very well, but it's not coming to mind right now. But if I could recall that, then I could probably translate it into this kind of vocabulary of the primary counteroffer and the emergent response and the stimulus. Is it that this is a bit embarrassing, but anyway. What is narcissism? The last thing I was thinking about narcissism was from listening to someone's presentation on dysfunctional families, and they were not really talking about narcissism in general, but they were talking about someone who would be attracted to or who would be married to an Oedipal mother. Which would be a kind of anima possessed man that goes through kind of rage cycles. This was from Heldo's presentation on a psychology disorder called a Discord called the Tea House, and they have a psychology club. It was a very good presentation. But the anima, that had me thinking about anima possession, and I did come up with a model of that, but I was trying to generalize it to narcissism, which it doesn't perfectly generalize into narcissism, or I didn't finish thinking about it. But it did have me thinking that it seems to me that all narcissism, at least has as its origin, but also as in some variant of the manifestation of its psychopathology, a dependence on an environmental judgment or an environmental ego which is perhaps a kind of ghost armor for the actual ego of the narcissist, which would be also called, they just call it the false self. I always forget Sam Vaknin's terminology. And so they accept that dominance because then they get the invulnerability of the false self, and they also get the imaginative dimension. But then that traps them into the introjective calculation or in terms of having to plot the trajectory of all the objects in the introjective paradigm and live vicariously through the introjective paradigm, while their ego stands unattended to, but also undeveloped or sort of atrophied. And perhaps, sort of almost a kind of living statue. But Sam Vaknin always describes it also as being fundamentally fragmented. Now, I would relate this to the kind of decompartmentalization which borderlines are often perpetrating on their victims, which is interesting because Sam Vaknin often describes the relationship between borderlines and narcissists as having a kind of natural affinity or whatever. I mean, I think that this is, obviously, if you have no hope of recovery, and it's not, I don't wish to sound too harsh, because maybe there's no publicity around there being an effective treatment, or an effective cure, only some kind of ameliorative treatment only. But I do see that as essentially that the reason why the narcissist feels attended to by the borderline is because it is a familiar form of abuse that is itself, let's say, the root supplementary encapsulation of the child by the Oedipal mother. I know that that's not a perfect, it's not going to fit every case, but let's just say that the narcissist is vulnerable to an Oedipal mother figure. I mean, perhaps you would even say that perhaps the narcissist wasn't even exposed to an Oedipal mother, but was exposed to enough trauma and abuse and denigration that they themselves conjectured an Oedipal mother, because that was the only form of mother that they could imagine out of the kind of dead mother that they were exposed to. And so, and calling them dead mothers is not without its merit, is not without its explanatory power, but is a kind of lowest common denominator that perhaps disguises the real mechanic in terms of the psychopathology of narcissism. That there was perhaps, although not exposed to an Oedipal mother, that from the kind of traumatic exposure that the child did receive, they could only extrapolate as an ideal or as a wish or as an aspiration to be associated with a figure that they could only imagine to be something like an Oedipal mother. Was the only thing that they could craft out of the base material that they had available in their environment to imagine from, and that perhaps was the first introjective object, or in some sense was the global introjective object, which was the premise of the unconscious side of the mind, or it was the foundation of the introjective paradigm, was an environmental Oedipal mother. And then that gets imprinted in the subconscious, and the subconscious can potentially the subconscious is going to have an imprint of the unconscious, and it's going to have an imprint of the ego. It's also going to have a more direct relationship to the ego. The subconscious and the ego, in terms of metatype, have a kind of direct circuitry between the two. And I'm going to have to weave that into my story of the karmic model as well. Sorry, I'm talking about so many things simultaneously. I think I'm going to pick this up after I've got more energy, but I think I'll continue this recording. And I'll pick up all these threads right where I've left off. I'll just make a note of them now.